guest is the unconventional economist with his treasury of common sense, the co-founder of macrobusiness.com.au, source of excellent newsletter, incidentally, Leith Van Onselen. Welcome, Leith.
G'day, David. Thanks for having me on again.
Well, it's always a pleasure, and we always do appreciate your common sense. Now, the context really of what we've been talking about, or much of what we've been talking about, are the enormous amount of funds Australia has received under the terms of trade, which is being shown on the graph up on the screen. And we did extraordinarily well. Unfortunately, the politicians seem to either hand that over to the foreign cartel or they wasted that money. In the Financial Review, the day before this is being filmed, Samantha McGulloch, who's the chief executive of Australian Energy Producers, said this: "The Australian Energy Market Operators Quarterly Energy Dynamics Report for April-June found gas power generation demand on the East Coast was up 70% on the last quarter and 16% on last year because of reduced solar and wind output, combined with high electricity demand. AMO said the result highlights the important role of flexible gas power generation as the ultimate backstop for the national electricity market during periods of reduced renewable generation. Follows AEMO's warning last month in its integrated plan, a roadmap for the NEM for 2050. It found Eastern Australia will need to build 13 gigawatts of new gas power generation infrastructure by 2050. That's more than the combined capacity of every wind turbine installed in Australia today. This is on top of the even greater volumes of gas needed to power Australia's manufacturing sector, which relies on gas for 42% of its energy needs." Well, that does really seem to accord with what you've been saying for so long, Leith.
Yeah, that's right, David. Look, gas is absolutely fundamental in Australia's energy transition. So the way it was always meant to work was that we would gradually replace coal-fired generation with renewables, and you'd have gas as the firming power, which would enable you to do that transition. And what I mean by firming power is renewables are by nature intermittent. So you only get power from, say, solar panels when the sun's shining. You only get power from wind when the wind's blowing. And that means that at all other times when you don't have those things online, you need to generate power somehow. And the best way to do that is through gas-fired generation. The reason why gas is so vital is because gas is the only source of fuel that can be turned on and off at a whim. So just like when you turn on your gas stove, you basically turn the switch, set the pilot light, bang, you're cooking. It's the same with electricity, whereas other forms of generation, for example, nuclear, coal, etc., those things take a long time to power up because they're slow-burning processes. So that's why if we're going to build out this renewable transition and we're going to get off coal, etc., we need gas as the backstop. And this is basically what the United States has done. So the United States is the world's biggest LNG exporter. It also has delivered itself ultra-cheap gas prices. So domestically, Americans last week were paying around $2 US a gigajoule for gas, which is about $3.50 Australian. And what they've done is they've a domestic reservation policy whereby they say, yes, you can export it, but you've got to supply Americans first. And because of this cheap gas prices in America, what America's done is it's basically in the process of closing down all its coal-fired power generation and has put gas turbines in their place in the same areas. And effectively, America has transitioned away into renewables, backed up by gas power generation. And as a result, America has cheap electricity prices. It has cheap gas prices for heating and for manufacturing, etc. And also, America's carbon emissions have actually fallen a lot quicker than Australia's because it's switched off coal quicker. And this is why gas is absolutely fundamental to Australia's energy transition and also to lowering emissions. And effectively, unfortunately, what we've done on the East Coast, as I've explained previously, is we've actually made gas incredibly expensive and we've stuffed the transition. And the way we've done that is we don't have any domestic reservation policy on the East Coast, unlike Western Australia, the United States, Qatar, every other gas exporter in the world. And as a result, we export over 70% of our East Coast gas. Most of it goes to China and Japan, etc. We export more gas than they need. And as a result, China and Japan are re-exporting. They're selling that for profit, arbitraging, basically. And we're starving ourselves of gas. And what that's done is it's pushed our gas price to between $12 and $25, depending on the day, per gigajoule, which is just obscene. Again, that compares to America, which is $3.50 to $4 Australian. And it's created this artificial gas shortage. And what it's basically meant is that because gas prices have gone up, which obviously hurts, households in Victoria, say, who need to heat their homes, but also manufacturers who need to run gas furnaces, etc. It's also pushed up the price of electricity because the gas price is the marginal price setter for electricity, because the way the national electricity market works is that the highest bid becomes sets the price of electricity. And because gas is generally the last bid because it's used for firming power, it sets the electricity price. And we've basically delivered ourselves an energy price shock in both high gas prices and high electricity prices because we haven't reserved our gas. And we've let a foreign-owned cartel take control of our gas supplies. And as a result, we're making ourselves poorer.
I seem to remember from the time when there was a debate about domestic reservation in Western Australia, subsequently was to go ahead and develop its own. But I seem to remember that the argument put by a number of economists was that it was somehow impure and improper to have a reservation policy, and you should really have the same price throughout the world. You shouldn't. It was akin to having tariffs, that it was the sort of impurity that you shouldn't have. Am I correct in that recollection?
Yeah, absolutely, you're correct. Now, I'm going to call them out here. The Grattan Institute has been absolutely disastrous for Australia on energy policy. So the Grattan Institute's, head of the energy program is a former Origin executive, so one of the gas cartel. And the Grattan Institute pressured the federal government not to have domestic reservation on the East Coast. They released a whole bunch of papers in 2013 saying that it's bad policy and that it's effectively protectionism, blah, blah, blah. They also lobbied the Western Australian government to get rid of their reservation program. Now, thankfully, the Western Australian government did not listen to the likes of Grattan, because if they had, they wouldn't have cheap gas and cheap electricity prices, and they wouldn't be insulated from the energy price shock that we're experiencing on the West Coast. So when Russia invaded Ukraine and sent the global gas prices through the moon, Western Australians were insulated. They weren't impacted by that. Us on the East Coast, by contrast, our prices shot through the roof. They'd already risen threefold from a decade ago before we started exporting on the East Coast. And then they went through the roof. They shot through the roof. That whole notion that you...
That was a Labor government, wasn't it? That was a Labor government that did that, the Carpenter government. Who was the federal government at the time who accepted the...
It was Labor.
It was Labor.
It was the Rudd-Gillard government. And to make matters worse, David, my recollection is that Martin Ferguson, when he was the Minerals Resources Minister, watered down the petroleum resource rent tax as well. So that means that we're getting less revenue now. So, look, it's an absolute disaster. And, this whole notion that it's protectionism, it's impure, we need to pay world prices, is just absurd. Can you imagine being a Saudi Arabian, filling up your car at the Bowser and paying $2 a litre at petrol just because the government says, oh, no, it's impure that you should have cheap oil, whilst they're selling their oil to the rest of the world? Like, to me, that's just absolutely bizarre. And it's had all these unintended consequences. So Australia's East Coast energy failure, it's obviously fueling inflation, because energy is a key input to everything. So it's a key input. If you run a cafe and you're paying high electricity prices to run your coffee machines and all that stuff, you're going to have to pass that on. If you're a manufacturer like Brickworks, which makes bricks, we need bricks to solve the housing crisis that's been caused by excessive immigration. If you have high energy prices in gas, well, then the input costs of those go up. So high energy costs feed into every form of inflation across the economy. It's one of the reasons why we have a cost of living crisis. It's one of the reasons why Australia's inflation is stubbornly high. And this has been brought to you by poor government policy that has basically, forced East Coast Australians to pay some of the world's highest gas and electricity prices, which is completely unnecessary given that we are a superpower in gas. Like we are the world's equal second biggest exporter alongside Qatar. We were the biggest until America took us over a year or so ago. We are swimming in gas.
Isn't one of the tricks of sensible policy to take to your comparative advantage? And you rely on your comparative advantage. We have heavy
100%.
labour costs, but we had cheap energy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've turned our overabundance in resources and minerals and things into a comparative disadvantage. Like you cannot think of more stupid policy than what Australia has done. We don't tax these things properly, so we don't get enough benefit from them. At the same time as we forced up our domestic cost base. And this is the thing, David. Australia already has the smallest manufacturing share in the OECD. And it just keeps shrinking because we've given up one of the advantages we used to have, which was low energy prices, to give ourselves high energy prices. And here's the ridiculous thing, that the Albanese government's solution to this, rather than fixing the underlying problem and reserving gas for domestic use, like every other place that exports gas in the world does, including Western Australia, is they want to hand out $27 billion of subsidies over a decade in their future-made manufacturing policy so that Australia can build solar panels and wind turbines and all this sort of rubbish when we have no comparative advantage in that area. And secondly, where is the plastics going to come from to go in those wind turbines and solar panels when our last plastics manufacturer, Quenos, has just shut down because of high energy prices? I mean, you cannot make this stuff up.
Well,
it is absurd.
The government's going to do the good thing, aren't they? They're going to make houses cheaper and more available for people. That's the policy, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But unfortunately, their energy policy and their immigration policy is working against both those means. I mean, Australia's just had a 40% increase in construction costs in dwellings over the last, since the pandemic began. And a lot of that's imported inflation, but some of it's domestically created because these high energy costs are feeding into high materials costs. So I've already mentioned Brickworks. Brickworks pays high gas prices, therefore its cost of its bricks goes up, which means you have cost push inflation in your building materials, and then that feeds into housing costs. So the policy making in Australia is back to front, and we really need an Australia first type policy that puts the welfare of Australians before the welfare of everyone else in the world. And here's the sad thing about it, David. A week ago, the Resources Minister, Madeleine King, was asked if she supports domestic reservation. She said, I quote, that if we reserve gas on the East Coast, we're going to create what she said was sovereign risk. And this is the other quote. She said, we will, quote, turn the lights off in countries that depend on Australia's gas for their energy security. So she's more concerned about the welfare of people in China, their energy costs, and turning the lights off there, even though we send more gas to them than they need and they resell it, than she is about her own countries, her own citizens, turning the lights off in Australia and shutting down manufacturers in Australia because of these high gas prices. So that there just shows you the kind of politicians we have in charge who care more about the welfare of people in Asia than her own countrymen who vote her in, who are her constituents. She does not care about us. And she literally has said that we will turn the lights off in countries that are dependent on our gas, even though we send more gas to them than they need. It's just absurd.
Leith, once again, you've shown us that you come with a treasury of common sense Thank you so much for your wisdom. I wish we had more time to discuss it today, but this is very important for Australians, and I think this is being reflected in the Redbridge poll, which has just come out. People are being concerned about this sort of thing. Thank you, Leith Van Onselen, and remember macrobusiness.com.au, which has a marvellous newsletter available to people. Thank you, Leith.
Thanks, David. I'll speak to you next time.